Okay. So, hello, I'm Cowper, and I'm standing right in the way of the projector. That's a good start. So I'm at Cowper on pretty much everything, and if you do find something on the internet that has Cowper on it and it's not me, please let me know, because I will attempt to do my best to get that, because it makes these slides a lot easier. So I'm a front-end developer based in lovely, sunny, although tonight stormy, very stormy, Berlin in Germany. And as you can tell, I am, German, obviously. And I work on a product and for a company called MoneyMap. They paid for my flights. So I have to put this up, and I'm just going to keep it up while I start the kind of presentation. Broadly, the little sponsor speech is we're essentially, in the UK it's so much easier than in Germany, because we're essentially USwitch, but in Germany. But we're unrelated. But you all know USwitch, yeah? Perfect, lots of nodding heads. So I'm going to be talking to you a bit about CSS and components. So I work on one of the two React apps we have. One of them is an internal admin interface to all of this magic going on in the front end. And we've essentially gotten to the point where we launched quite quickly. We've built some quite cool stuff. This is the gas recommendations portal, and we're working on multiple devices. We're trying to do our best in keeping our React code base nice and dry and using components properly. But it's essentially getting to the point that we've gone very quickly. We launched with electricity and gas, and then we've moved on to phone contracts, which is a whole other host of fun. If you want to know the ins and outs of phone contracts in the EU, feel free to ask me at the bar afterwards. It is very interesting but horrifically boring for this presentation. So with React and with other component-based things, so Angular Post 2, I think, is all components now and directives and all kinds of fun, Vue, all these things, we have JavaScript components that are rendering portions of our UI. Now that's really cool. It's really helpful to have JavaScript doing all that for us, figuring out what needs to be on the page, what doesn't need to be on the page, and you can do all kinds of magic and figure out that you only load the JavaScript that you need to load on a particular page or when you render a particular component, and that's really helpful. But with CSS, that's a bit more challenging, as it turns out. There are some ways and means of doing that. Some of them will mean that you lose out on some power of CSS because you're treating your CSS as raw JavaScript. You're, creating objects and then using that to build inline styles or all kinds of fun. And we've got a modern but traditional style CSS stack. We build all of our CSS separately. We put in a link tag and load all the CSS that we need right from the get-go. The login page, you have all of the CSS that you need to go through checkout, go through everything. And I think that was definitely standard up until very, very recently. So we've gotten to the point where our JavaScript things, our components and our containers and all kinds of whatever the newest thing to call your React components is, we've got all that in JavaScript land, and that's really nice. But it's quite difficult to get that in CSS. So we've reached a tipping point where it becomes we've worked hard on trying to make our JavaScript components easy to learn and easy to grasp from very little. You don't have to have used it within the last week to remember the API. We've tried our best to really think about those boundaries and when we go to a new component or whether we just add HTML into an existing one. But the CSS hasn't scaled in the same way. We've now, for want of a better way of putting it, we've got a legacy CSS code base. We have lots of CSS that works, but we're kind of worried of changing some things because we know that we're setting class names in JavaScript. We're doing all kinds of, if this state exists, then add this class name. We're making things disabled and all kinds of weird things. So what I wanted to research, and the result of that research is this talk, is how we can make that better, how we can bring our CSS not into our JavaScript per se, but bring our CSS into a more modular kind of way where we know exactly what CSS we need for any given thing. We're not relying on magic, we're not relying on random element selectors in one component that affect a further component down the line. So we have some goals. So we want to move toward a style guide or pattern library or words that mean that kind of thing. Something like React Storybook we're quite into. But it's quite difficult to know what CSS we load, and if we were to do it right now with our current CSS setup, every single component would just load the same CSS file, and that's not really useful for a style guide. It's not really helpful to know that somewhere in this massive file of like 20-odd imports of other files that we have the appropriate CSS that we need to style a button yellow instead of purple, for example. So we should be able to lower the barrier of entry into our code base because we're not relying on implicit, magic behavior that only works because we've set up a selector in a certain way and there's a sibling and, all kinds of things that you can totally do in CSS and it's completely valid. But it makes jumping into a random component that you've not seen in 6 months a little bit more difficult as soon as you want to change styles. We've also got multiple themes. That becomes a bit of a nightmare when you're trying to think, okay, what color is this supposed to be in this state? So yeah, we want to lower the level of thought needed to understand our CSS in the same way that we've tried to do with our JavaScript. And it should be easy to extend existing components with new styles. It should be easy to say, make this button primary, and it should just work. And I think really the crux of the whole thing, and especially with the general CSS in JavaScript movement, is that while learning CSS is easy, mastering it is really difficult. And I don't mean mastering as in remembering how to do a flex declaration off the top of your head and get it right every time. This is like mastering the architecture of CSS and mastering the code base that you need. And it's very difficult to test CSS as well, especially in JavaScript land. You kind of just have to take it on faith that if I have this class name on this component, then that's good enough. And really, from me learning CSS and working with it for the last few years, like managing the cascade is hard. Like that's actually really difficult, especially when you've got a component that goes from midway through a form inside div, inside div, inside div, inside div, to, and you just say, well, I just want to use that input and the submit button, but I want to use it on this page over here, and that becomes a bit more difficult, and it adds extra thought that you have to make in order to figure out where the boundaries of your CSS component are versus the boundaries of your JavaScript component. And what I like about React is that managing components can be quite easy. If you have like nice functional components that just render the props that they're given, and there's no complex logic in there, and if there is, it's mostly JavaScript logic. So if we think in components when we're building our JavaScript, if we think with components when we're building in JavaScript land, wouldn't it be cool to think about the same thing in CSS land? So in JavaScript, in React rather, we have these containers components, and the idea that you can compose different components depending on the state of your container. So just quick straw poll, hands up those of you who have heard of /seen/used React. Got a fairly React heavy, okay, cool. I don't feel as bad. So yeah, it's entirely possible to do all this with regular CSS loaded in a single place. There are things called BEM and SMACs and ITCSS, which will allow you to either organize and name your classes or organize your folder structures such that you should be able to say, okay, this is a component, this is a button, and then that you assume will map directly to the button component. But for me, the problem with BEM, SMACs, and ITs and suits and all of the other acronyms that we web developers somehow come up with is that they're convention. There's no rule that says if you're in a BEM codebase, you must make BEM classes. And even if you do, you might accidentally call two blocks that should be the same different. For example, hands up, those of you who can tell me what the difference between a header and a billboard is. For the record, no hands. So it's difficult. So if we look at some code now, this is quasi-React, but I hope it's kind of understandable even if you've never seen React. We'll set up a class name called className, import the style CSS, and render with the class name string classname. So that should be reasonably easy to follow. So for those of you who've maybe seen this import style file syntax, you might not know what's going on behind the scenes. So what's actually happening is the CSS loader is taking this in, and as a side effect, it's letting your JavaScript know before it gets built roughly what's going on. Webpack will then usually do the extract text Webpack plugin. I really should write that down in my speaker notes somewhere because I'm pretty sure it's somehow wrong because Webpack plugins are named confusingly. But it will take that out and rip out the CSS file and shove it in a link tag in your head, and you never need to think about it again. Now that's helpful, but then all your class names are strings. They will become the same string in your HTML. And that means that you might have collisions. You might have unusual CSS if it's more than one declaration and it adds in element selectors or IDs or all kinds of fun things. And that's when the cascade might hurt you. So our first talking point, it should be quite a short one, is CSS modules. So this is something that will allow you to change the way that your CSS is loaded. It's not adding JavaScript into your CSS, it's not adding CSS into your JavaScript, it's purely changing how your CSS is loaded. So this looks very similar to the previous one because you have an actual CSS file over there that you can do what you want with. But then CSS module loader allows you to pull in an object where every key is a class name. So you can use the class name object, and behind the scenes, the CSS module loader will make that a unique hash, both based on the location of the file and the class name that you specify. So I'll show you how that looks in just a moment. But that's kind of all right. Like that gets around naming collisions in a non-convention-driven way. That's pure programmatic. This will not collide until you have X billion class names in the same file, for example. So the cool thing about CSS modules is this composition. So we've added one new declaration, which is the composes. Which allows you to take all of the styles that are in one class name and bring them into another one and override them as needed. So that's pretty handy. That's pretty cool because that means you don't need to use Sass to get the features of extends, for example. And extends will actually, there's a really good article that I have still yet forgotten to actually add to this on what extends actually outputs, because it does not output the CSS that you expect. So extends will actually pollute lots of your CSS just to accomplish this feature. Whereas this CSS modules will take all the classes in all the declarations in the class name class, apply them into another class name, and then get rid of anything that overrides and switch it out for the ones that you specify. So that's super helpful. And behind the scenes here, the CSS loader in module mode replaces every locally scoped identifier with a global unique name, hashed from the module name and local identifier by default. That's what I needed. And then extending adds the source class name to the list, to the exports of your file. So you can actually compose from another file. So you can have your colors in one file, your margins in another, and you always know that you're getting the same color, the same, the brand color, the brand margins, paddings, etc. So that looks a little like this. I will admit I did not hash that. I just mashed my keyboard and then put a dot in the middle. I'll own up to that. It might not be a valid hash. So that's really cool, and that's a really good stepping stone kind of from a traditional CSS with everything in one file. The first thing is just import the file that you think you need, and if something breaks, you know that you're depending on some global CSS somewhere. And that can be really helpful in isolating errors and doing all kinds of things. But it doesn't really help us with a lot of what we need. It's not really helpful for a style guide, for example. It doesn't enforce anything else that CSS wouldn't enforce by default. So I started looking into styled components. And that's kind of where I'm going to spend most of the rest of the talk. So as far as I can tell, and yes, the emoji, I believe, is part of the actual name of it. So if you do want to tweet about this, please use the little nail polish emoji. But yeah, as far as I can tell, it's the best way to currently modularize your CSS in React. I cannot find a better way. There's also a Vue port that isn't quite complete, but it's definitely on the way. And the beauty of styled components is, while the base implementation is for React, there's nothing stopping you using the same API, building the same thing, taking advantage of the same features and generating Angular components or Polymer components or web components or raw DOM operations. There's genuinely nothing stopping you. Now, I will say before I skip to showing you some code, the API does look a bit weird. Honestly, it will make sense, I swear, and the more examples I show, I think the better it'll get in your head, but it does look really weird because it uses backticks to call functions, not brackets. You can use brackets, but the backticks do allow you to do some pretty cool things. So we'll take styled from styled components, and then we'll create our H1 element with color tomato. Also, thoroughly recommend looking up the CSS named colors because there are some brilliant ones. I like tomato. And this will output a React component. So all of a sudden, you don't need to worry about linking your HTML or your JSX, in this case, to your CSS. All of your styles are baked in, and they will output regular CSS. And anything that you can write in CSS can go in those backticks. I'll show you later some media queries and some, I think media queries is most of the ones I've got on the slides. But feel free to chat to me later, and we can go through some extra fun stuff. So I know, okay, hands up who's feeling a bit weary that I've just put CSS into my JavaScript. Yeah, it's a bit weird, right? So if I've put CSS into my JavaScript can change my CSS. I don't need to worry about manipulating class names directly. I just need to worry about the output of the styles. So I'll show you a slightly nicer way of doing this later. But if your title is primary, it can be tomato or dodger blue. So at that point, your React component can take a title component and then take primary as a prop, and all of a sudden the color changes. You didn't need to worry about any extra styles, any extra classes. You didn't even need to worry. If you only render primary titles, you won't even see the original CSS files out in your output. So that's really helpful because that means that every single time your JavaScript says, oh, I'm going to do some clever code splitting and I will only show this component, I will only send down to the client the JavaScript required to show this component, or you server render it and you're even faster. You now only have the styles that you need in any given place. And that's really cool. So that looks a bit like this. It's SC and then another hash. So before the break, which I think is coming up-ish, hopefully. Otherwise I've gone too fast and then I can just waffle more. Okay. So let's go backwards. So yeah, without using any weird imports, without using any side effects with Webpack to allow you to get actual CSS out, this is going to generate actual CSS and put it out as a CSS file at the end. Style Components internally is doing a very similar thing to CSS Modules, where it's going to take the CSS that you put in and generate a class name based on a hash of the component name. So now, all you need to worry about is naming one thing, the component that you needed to name anyway. You don't need to worry about combining them. If you rename the component, it doesn't matter. And that's really powerful and really cool. Yeah, I'm just going to go to the conclusions. We can have the break early, and then I can come and talk to you more about what cool things this enables, because that's kind of how I structured it. So I essentially had a 25-minute, half-hour talk, and I thought, well, I can talk about extra stuff. So I put the break in, and I appear to have put it in a bit early. But conclusions for now. You might not need it, right? If you're really good at CSS, your code base is clean, it's linted, it's tested, it's wonderful. Genuinely, I'm not going to be here and say, you know what, you need to convert. What are you talking about? Because A, that's not my place, and B, it might not benefit you. If you've got like fantastic performance with a regular CSS setup, or you're using some other method, that's okay, right? Like I'm not selling it to you. I don't make any money if you use it, right? So if you're like me with a legacy CSS setup that you're not entirely sure what you can and can't change, the first thing that I would do is just try importing what you think as only the CSS, using CSS modules, is only the CSS that you need, and then see what breaks. And that can be really helpful even if it is only to fix some problem in your CSS, some global thing that you're relying on that doesn't exist, and that kind of thing. So that can be really helpful. Now, Once you're there, you might think, oh man, I'm doing lots of, like we do lots of class names manipulation. There's an NPM package called class names for this exact purpose, where you can take in, you create a function, you say, okay, if we're in light mode, make the class this. If we're in dark mode, make the class this. Or we pass in some props and pass in some arguments. We do all kinds of fun things. And at that point where you're kind of going, well, my CSS looks all right, you know, my styles look all right, everything works. But it would be really helpful if I could literally reduce the size of my bundle by not having to do any extra class name manipulation. It should also speed up the render because it doesn't need to think about, oh, what class name goes on this? Then check out style components if you want. You know, it's no skin off my nose, frankly. But it's fun. And yeah, keep your eyes out for fun new stuff like styled components. I'll show you some more fun stuff in that sphere, in the community around styled components. If you're using React, you can use it directly. If you're using Vue, I was looking up today, they've still got some things that they need to be wary of, and some bits of CSS that they don't yet support and this kind of thing. But it's definitely, for me, it's the best way that I can see to actually properly modularize and properly componentize your CSS. So let's do some extra credit styled components. I've kind of introduced you, given you a little taste of what happens when, you know, the bizarre Scotsman in front of you tells you that putting your CSS in your JavaScript isn't so bad after all. So this is now the 4th time I've given this talk, and I did get a couple of recurring questions. Amazingly, you've managed to come up with brand new questions, so this is all kind of just a guess. So yeah, if any of these interest you, then just wait and listen. If any of them don't, feel free to just interrupt. Because this is the freestyle round where I just have some stuff that I can show you. But if you're like, nah, don't care. I've also got the website running locally on my machine in case the Wi-Fi didn't work. So if you have any other questions, got that too. So the first thing that you might want to do is, okay, so if I've got 2 styled components and I want one of them to influence the styles of the other, how am I going to do that? Because I can't put a class name on it. Well, 2 things. Spoiler alert, you totally can put regular class names onto it next to your style components. But you can also just take your component declaration, import it, and use it straight in the tag template literal. So that's quite cool. So if you've got an icon that you want to change the color of when you hover over the link, and the link is over the whole thing, that's quite helpful. So, you know, feel free to interrupt, don't worry. It's all right. It's not that many slides. It's fine. So what about external components? You got like React Router DOM is exporting a link, and you're like, oh, I don't want to add another wrapping div. I've got too many wrapping divs. Yeah, that works too. You can pass styled in instead of using the dot. They're just helpers around this slightly more traditional looking API. It still is the backticks, but you've now got brackets. So you can pass in whatever component you want. It will generate your styles and add the class name. So this is one of the bits that I took out of the original talk because I thought it fits a lot better in the extra credit, which is why we got out for break a little earlier. What happens if you want to do that composes? That looked really cool, right? So you actually just have every style component has an extend method. You can take in and override your styles. The class names won't be polluted with Sass's extends kind of thing. They will just have the CSS that you expect them to. So yeah, that button, the title.primary and switching the color between 2 colors, that's, you know, a toy example, but what if I've got 5 variants and I want to, you know, change them all? So there's this mess, and feel free, it is a mess. I'm going to show you how to fix that, don't worry. I'm not saying this is the best thing. So yeah, you can use a thing called styled map, which is just another NPM package. And you wind up basically saying if it's primary, make it orange. If it's warning, make it red. If it's info, make it, yeah, you can read, right? Maybe not in the back, I don't know. So yeah, media queries, that was a common question. What do they look like? Turns out they look exactly like media queries. I wasn't joking when I said it is actual just CSS. It's using Glamour, I think, under the hood, and they've got an abstraction on top of Glamour that does all this, so you can just write regular CSS. And I think that's one of the main things that differentiates it from other CSS in JS solutions. You're not limited by JavaScript's syntax or anything. You just write straight up CSS, which makes porting components literally as easy as copy and paste. So yeah, you think, well, yeah, but media queries are quite annoying, and I've got variables, and I want to use my CSS variables. You can use your CSS variables with a bit of trickery, or you can declare your variables in JavaScript, and you can use this, I think it's styled -media -query, and then you get media less than medium, media greater than large. For me, at least, that looks a bit more readable than traditional CSS. I don't really need to think too much, and I quite like any new bit of programming that means I have to think less. So yeah, here's the big stuff, and I think one of the questions was the theme provider. What happens if you want to make a theme, and this is the situation that we were in. We actually wrote our own theme provider so that we could change class names at the root level and everything would just work. So styled theming is another NPM package where you can declare an object with all of your variants. So you can have mode dark, light, you can have however many you want. It's just an object. So you can also have size large or size small or animation on or animation off. And you can do all kinds of things. And you use that in your components with this theme helper. You say on the mode, when it's light, return this color. When it's dark, return this color. So variance-wise, you then have a lot more control, and I know it looks a bit weird, but that's mostly because I had to fit the code on the slide. This wouldn't pass my ESLint setup. But yeah, so light and dark for all of the different things, and you're now taking in multiple theme options and declaring them right there next to the component. So yes, there's some helper tools. There's jest styled components, which you import, and it adds has style rule. So you can determine whether in state X or with props, Y and Z, for want of a less terrible way of describing this in words. You can say, okay, is this color red? Which is quite difficult to do in CSS, because all you can like when you're testing, because all you can really say is this class name being applied? It's very difficult to, in your JavaScript test, to say, is this class name being applied and does it look right? That's usually two separate tests where you've got visual regression testing or similar. Then there's a double whammy of the stylint config and processor. So you can actually lint your CSS within your styled components. You don't need to worry about losing that benefit of writing a separate CSS file. And there's a Babel plugin that adds support for server-side rendering, minifies your styles, and gives you a nicer debugging experience, because then Babel knows kind of a bit of the internals of styled components. So the conclusions to this part, and then I'm going to pull out my Twitter client and then start answering questions from that. The community is small, growing and adding new platforms quite quickly. It started in React. There's already a Vue thing going on, and I personally want to try and do it as minimal as possible and just do DOM operations. So that's going to be quite an interesting project that may or may not have been started already. Yeah, if you don't use React, the ideas and concepts should still be applicable, and given enough time, you should still have either a framework or no framework version of this API. So that's pretty cool. And definitely try out new things. It's super fun. It can help you fly from Berlin to Newcastle to come and speak in a Victorian library, which is pretty sweet. So I'm going to put my Twitter up now, and thank you, but don't applaud yet. I'm going to start answering questions from here. So Duarte Montero says, what are your thoughts on JavaScript inline? This has become a radio show or something. What are your thoughts on JavaScript inline styles? I'm assuming this isn't a library. This is just raw inline styles. Duarte? Yeah, it's super helpful if that's the only thing that you have. As soon as you want to have a hover element, a pseudo element, anything that's a bit fancier CSS-wise, then it falls down. It's also, if you've got only JavaScript inline styles, it's really annoying to override them, and especially, so I use Material UI, the library for our internal tooling, and because I'm not using the beta 1.0 because I wrote it a year ago when didn't exist, they use inline styles in JavaScript to export the components. And if I want to change what a bloody text field looks like, oh my God, I have to override it and I have to put importance everywhere. And it's kind of, what I really like about style components is you wind up thinking about your styles with your components. It sounds like a really, weird thing to say that, frankly, for me, should be the slogan. Think about your styles when you think about your components. But yeah, with the CSS and with inline styles, you don't necessarily think that, because you might, especially if you start putting them into JavaScript, you think, oh, I'm going to put my grid over here. And then all of a sudden, to onboard somebody onto why does this page look like it does, you have to then show them all of your JavaScript objects or all of your variables in CSS. And I think it's getting to the point where it's becoming as fast, if not faster, to not do that and to just say, okay, this component will always work. And this is like, I think it's Vue that has this single file component thing where everything is together, so that's the only thing that you need. And what I like about styled components is you wind up being able to npm install a single component from wherever you want. It will look like that, but you can override it without overriding with inline styles. You can just add classes. Oh, I've got 2 new notifications. Oh, this is going to be confusing. Is there any benefit? Oh, sorry. Rick Butterfield. This is honest to God a phone and radio program now. Is there any benefit to styled components over adding partial style sheet alongside for HTTP2 delivery? One, browsers that don't support HTTP2 won't get it. They will get it in blocking single thread. And yeah, adding partial style sheet helps, but you need to know what style sheet you need to send at a specific time. So this is the CSS Modules style thing where if you're importing even on a completely non-React static thing, if you're using that idea, then you build, okay, this is the about page CSS, this is the home page CSS, and then you have a global CSS for everywhere that can be downloaded once and then cached, and then you have individual pages that you send parallel, which over HTTP2, sure, that works totally well. The biggest overhead to use styled components specifically in that sense would probably be adding React or explaining how to get your server to actually serve React components at that point. I mean, it might work flawlessly. Frankly, I would say global CSS, especially if you have kind of sections of your app. So that for us, we've got the pre-main page where we're still taking in details, where the user isn't a complete user in our internal terminology. They're still waiting on their first name or their last name, and this this kind of thing. And because we need addresses, because we're doing electricity and gas switches and this kind of thing, so we could have one style sheet that gets delivered there, and then the styled components can be delivered once, and then once we hit the next button, we don't need to re-download it. And then once you get into the main core of the app, you might not actually need to ever see the before you're a complete user, and this kind of thing. So yes, I could see ways that style components could help. Partial style sheet delivery over H2 would work for sure, but you would really need to be your environment, and probably the developer would need to know a lot about what CSS you actually needed at which point, and style components will do that for you. As long as it works locally, it will work in the future. So I have no new notifications, that's good. Anthify here is an example of the theme provider. I'm assuming that's what I just showed, I think. Kind of. It's not attached to the tweet though. No, it just says Lewis Cowper. Here is an example of the theme provider. Ah, okay. Yeah. Sorry. So we haven't yet. So we built our own theme provider that would attach a theme class name at the root of the document and at the root of any portals. So this is a cool thing in React 16 for those React people, which seemed to be about 75% of the audience. I don't know if you're using it in production or you just know of it. But React 16 allows portals, which means you don't. So we had an issue where we were importing our modal component from Material UI, because we didn't want to deal with the cross-browser stuff, and we needed to build 4 modules in the time it would be to build a single module that would work everywhere. So we imported it, but what we realized was it doesn't render into your React container. It renders outside at the bottom of the page. And we had issues because attaching a class name to our React root meant that those things did not know what the theme class was. So we had to do lots of messing about within that theme provider to say, okay, the next time you render something, if you're rendering not in the root, add this class too. And we had to really overthink it, and it just seemed a bit weird. But with React 16, with the portal rendering, it means that those things that would otherwise render at the bottom of the page with their own isolated scope will now render inside your app-ish. I think they will still, in DOM-wise, be outside it, but internally you can at least refer to it inside. So does that kind of get it a bit? I mean, I can open up our actual theme provider if you want, maybe later at the pub. George Coldham says, with styled components with the nail polish emoji, good. How easily can you integrate a monolithic corporate style sheet when starting on new projects? Okay, for that, let us open this, which might be terribly small. I'm sorry. I hope that this zooms properly. A minute, let me, can I just put that down for a moment? Let me do some dev tools to make that a bit easier. Or I can just hopefully open it. I just want to get rid of the menu at the side, you see. So, yeah. Is that, oh, I'm just zooming in the dev tools now. Now zooming has scrolled me away. So, yes, you totally can, because you can still attach your own class names. So if you imagine there's an existing app that has the classes small and big, and yeah, you can use this styled.button.atters, like attributes but shorter, and you can attach your own class name. So monolithic corporate style sheet, I believe, was the the exact phrase used. That's not my my aspersions being cast or anything. You can attach your own class names to it, and it will still work, and you wind up with a styled component as the output, which will have the styled component classes and your classes. So if you've got your monolithic style sheet, because the styled components doesn't affect the delivery of, if you've set up a link tag with your style sheet in it, that will still work. There's nothing changing in the way that you're loading anything. There's lots of magic going on behind the scenes to allow styled components to build, but it's all contained within the styled components library. So yes, anything more? Can I store styled components in a separate file and just require? Yes, you can. That's kind of what I want to do. Generally, so for example, we have buttons. I think hands up if you do not have any buttons in your app. Okay, perfect. Buttons are a good example to pick. I'll remember that. So we have a button, we've got a button primary, we've got a button secondary, we've got a button link. The base button tag will get some styles, and then we attach a type to it. So we can use props. And what the props will do is affect the class name. So what I want to do is say if button props primary, make it yellow. I think that's the right color. I forget continuously, and then start typing, oh, type primary, oh, that's the wrong color, type secondary. I want to just say make it yellow, frankly. You can require the button component and then extend it with color, whatever, yellow, and then you can do it that way. You can export an extended button component. So I think that was, oh, my mouse is all over the place. So that was extends. Oh wow, it's because I'm in full screen in Chrome. That's not helpful. There we go. Yeah, that wasn't theming. It was before theming. It was before media queries. It wasn't that. I will get there, I swear. Yes, this styled button and then button.extend. So you can declare a default color and a default border, and you can change whatever you want in that point. Or you could do something a bit more similar to my earlier one, which is this one, where props primary will change the color of the button directly. And then you can export a title component or a button component. And then you could also export a button with default props of primary as primary button. So then you never need to worry about what props am I actually providing to change the style, because you can just export all of them as you need it. There's various different ways, because within the backticks you just have a tag template literal. I say just as if that's a normal thing to say, but yeah, you've got a reasonable amount of control over what styles happen and where they happen. So you can either use props and then declare a title with prop primary, or you can use or you can use something more complex. You can declare themes, you can declare all kinds of things. Where is the CSS rendered served in the DOM? Now that is a very good question, because it's not one that I've remembered to add. So let me close out this. I hope this is all right, Martin. Just waffling. So my hope is that because I've got the styled components thing here with the thing open, I'm gonna go out on a limb and hope that the styled components website is using styled components, which may or may not work. Oh, it's using next. So that's not a good sign. That's definitely not a good sign. Next. Oh, and I've got it in dev mode. It's doing all kinds of nonsense. Where is the CSS? It's being served by Webpack. No, it's not. Broadly, I don't know, but I can definitely help you find out. Who's this? Andrew Tate. Don't know where you are. Andrew Tate. There you are. Yeah, let's find out together in the pub. Because I do know that there's an answer for it for sure, and it does generate actual class names, so the CSS does exist. Oh, actually, the alternative is, if it's not in sources, is just to go into the elements, isn't it? We could check. Oh, no, don't. Accidental right-click. Style component CSS. Oh, there we go. Yeah, data style components. It's there, innit? That's where it is. It's there. We didn't even need to go to the pub. We should still go to the pub. I'm not. Like maybe if I scroll up. Yeah, I don't know. We'll have to go to the pub to find out. Feel free to shout questions. By the way, Twitter isn't the only medium that you can use to ask them. For one, because my data is not great. Oh, here we go. Kaspars. You quite often hear front-end developers say CSS in JS is weird, or HTML in JS is. Oh no, this isn't a question. Oh, sorry. I'm just reading out praise potentially. I was like, I blame Kaspars. But yeah, so the crux of where am I still? No, I'm not presenting. Present, you idiot. Go. Oh, what have I done now? That was interesting. I don't know what I did there. I pressed Command and caps lock. That's fun. So let's skip forward through the conclusions, because we have in fact concluded. And I will say thank you.